Thank you, Yolanda. And thank you, Robin, for your great presentation and your important work to combat AAPI prejudice and hate. We really appreciate all these persistent efforts. So I hope in my portion now, by talking about the historical trauma and mental health needs of AAPI, it will become apparent that we all share a lot of collective suffering as humans, and that, and hopefully it would help us to have more empathy, understanding, and solidarity across racial divides. Let me first try to share my slides. Let's see if you could. Okay, are you able to see the? Are you able to see my slide? Okay, great.
Very well, thank you.
Great, perfect. So, yeah. So, let me first just a little background. Let me see if I can play the. Okay. So, you know, there's about 22.9 million Asian Americans living in the U.S. Based on the Census Bureau. About 59% of them are foreign-born, and about 30% live in California, and of that majority live in our county. It is the fastest-growing race and ethnic group in the U.S. Its population doubled from 2000 and 2019, and it's projected to double again to exceed 40 million by 2060. Now, there are about 43 distinct Asian ethnic groups and over 100 Asian languages spoken in the U.S., according to U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And there's 6 of them. The largest group account for about 85% of the AAPI population. And these are, in order, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. You know, of the entire AAPI population, nearly half has limited English proficiency, but there is tremendous variation among the different Asian ethnic groups in their level of education, income, acculturation, exposure to war, as well as other historical trauma. And by historical trauma, I'm referring to trauma experienced collectively by entire race, ethnic, or cultural population. What may come to mind for you could be the violent colonization of Native Americans, the slavery experience of African Americans, perhaps the Holocaust, right? And you know, the research on historical trauma has found a higher prevalence of disease, both physical and mental, even several generations after the original trauma occurred. And such as the higher rates of PTSD and depressive disorder and anxiety disorder in the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who never experienced the original Holocaust themselves. Now, why talk about historical trauma or AAPI? Well, first, because it's less well known, it's not often talked about. And second, I think it might provide perhaps a helpful context of why the recent increase in hate crimes might be so triggering for the AAPI communities. And lastly, and most importantly, as I mentioned, that I hope that it will help us walk away with a sense that we all share so much collective suffering as human beings, and hopefully help us have greater empathy, understanding, solidarity with one another as humans. Now, many of you know that Long Beach has the largest Cambodian population outside of Cambodia, and some of you have seen, you know, these older films such as The Killing Fields, might have a glimpse of what it's like, you know, in terms of the experience of Cambodian genocide, in which a third of their country's populations was killed between 1975 to 79 through starvation, execution, and torture by the Khmer Rouge, which is a radical communist movement that took over Cambodia. In a study that was published in the Journal of American Medical Association in 2005, you know, of the Cambodian adults residing in the city of Long Beach who lived through the war in Cambodia, 99% of them experienced near death due to starvation. 90% of them experienced family members or friends murdered, and 56% witnessed killings, and 54% were tortured themselves. And after they migrated to the US, a third to a quarter of them experienced violence in their communities here in Long Beach. The rate of PTSD in this community sample of Cambodian adults were staggering at 62% compared to 3.5% in the general US population. Major depression disorder at 51% compared to 7.1% in the general US population. And you can see there's also a lot of poverty in this population. Now, the Chinese is the largest ethnic group among the AAPI population, accounting for 23% of the AAPI population in the US. In terms of historical trauma, I will go back to roughly about 150 years or 3 generations. You know, early on, there was the 2 Opium Wars around 1850. The British won the right to flood Chinese market with opium, and about over 1/2 of the Chinese male were addicted, including my paternal grandfather, who I've never met. And then during the 8 years of Japanese invasion of China, about 80 years ago, roughly 6 to 14 million Chinese were killed through massacre, starvation, and forced labor. And then not long afterwards, Mao Zedong, the father of the communist China, have initiated a number of social political movements that really led to the death of over 45 million through famine, as well as the subsequent Cultural Revolution, where millions of people were persecuted, including my uncle, who was in Shanghai at the time, because my father and my other uncles have escaped to Taiwan from China when the communists took over. So they were considered from a family of being disloyal to communist China. So, and as you can see, after the Chinese migrated to the US, as Robin talked about earlier, they continue to face, you know, a lot of targeted discrimination and violence due to their race. Now, the Indian or South Asians is the second largest group within the AAPI population, accounting for about 20% of the population. And during the British colonial rule, you know, there was a tremendous poverty, slavery, and famine were quite widespread. There were about 2 million indentured laborers to many of the British colonies, and these indentured laborers were basically like slaves. Most were illiterate, and the British merchant had then signed a contract to work and, say, get paid for after 5 years, and usually extremely harsh and horrible living and working conditions, such as working 16 hours a day with very little food. And many died before they can finish the 5-year contract, for example. Then the day after India declared its independence from the British, they were the India-Pakistan petition about 75 years ago, during which there were large-scale violence, arson, killing, resulted in over 1 million people died during that time, and then more than 15 million people fled their homes. There were also large-scale mass abduction and violent gang rapes of women during that time. The Filipino Americans are the 3rd largest group among the AAPI population, and the Filipinos have lived through about 350 years of Spanish colonial rule, followed by about 50 years of American rule, and then 2 years of Japanese occupation. Now, during the American colonial rule, many young Filipinos were taught about the American dream, many in the missionary schools. And during that time, due to the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 that restrict Asians from immigrating to the US, but because of the Philippines were considered a part of the US territory, so the Filipinos were sort of exempt from that restrictive act. So a large number of them migrated to the US during that time in search of the American dream. But many found that they were were quite disillusioned because they could only find menial jobs as migrant laborers on farms and canneries. And many of the scholars talk about that sense of colonial mentality where there's almost that internalized sense of inferiority or shame or hopelessness and depression in terms of the impact of that history. Now, next, the Vietnamese Americans account for about 9% of the API population. Many of you have seen films like Indochine may recognize it was once under French colonial rule for about 100 years, and then 5 years under Japanese rule. And then, of course, later came the Vietnam War, in which over 2 million Vietnamese were killed and 12 million became refugees. And many came to the US, and like many other groups, many worked hard and became successful, but many also faced discrimination, stress, and just again, similar to other immigrants, they often living higher crime rate areas because those areas were more affordable. And consequently, they experienced more violence after their migration as well. The Korean Americans account for about 8% of the API population. Korea was under Japanese colonial rule for about 35 years. During that time, over 1 million Koreans died as forced laborers. And then hundreds of thousands of Korean women were forced into a life of comfort women, which basically were sexual slaves who served in military brothels. Shortly after, then came the Korean War, which was largely between the US and Russia. Later became South and North Korea. It was a very deadly war with 5 million civilian death toll in 3 years, compared to the 2 million civilian death in 20 years of Vietnam War. So you can have a sense of how fatal that was. Now, after migrating to the US, like other groups, many face discrimination and change in their socioeconomic status, language barriers, and cultural stress. Many of you remember in 1992, the LA riot after the jury acquitted the 4 PD officers charged with excessive force in the beating of Rodney King. Many of you may not realize that the Korean Americans really bear the brunt of all the violent looting during that riot, and with very little help from the police. In fact, the road between K-Town and the wealthier white neighborhoods were blocked by the police as containment lines. And so none of the police were going in and respond when the Korean Americans called 911 for help. You can only imagine what that experience, the impact of that kind of experience might be. Now, the Japanese Americans account for about 6% of the US AAPI population. Many of you know that about 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their home, detained, and sent to living internment camps for about 3 years during World War II. Most of them were Nisei, or second-generation American citizens born in the US, but suspected of disloyalty simply because of their Japanese heritage. And you can imagine there's a sense of betrayal by a trusted source, a kind of deep feeling of shame and depression, or that sense that there must be something wrong with me. And during even resettlement after the war was over, many found their farmland and house was seized by their white neighbors, for example. So I know Pam, right after my talk, will share more about those experiences, even from her family, who have gone through some of that. So I'll let you hear that from her direct experience. Now, with the little remaining time that I have, I will just briefly highlight a few mental health issues in the API population. While the rate of suicide of API is lower compared to the general US population, but in 2 specific age groups, the rates are higher. For example, researchers have found in the Asian elderly, for example, the Korean elderly, the Chinese elderly, as well as Asian American elderly female, have the highest suicide rate among all racial ethnic groups in the US. The Asian American students also have higher rates of ideation and attempts compared to other race and ethnic groups. So another thing that is, I think most people are aware, is that Asian Americans tend to underutilize public mental health services compared to the other racial groups. Even in some of the early research by Stanley Hsieh and others, once they were admitted to treatment, about 50% of them would drop out after the first session. And some of the cultural factors that come into play include the stigma and shame around mental illness in the API community. There's also the cultural differences in illness expression and recognition. For example, it's very common for within API cultures for psychological distress to be expressed in the form of physical complaints or discomfort, such as headaches and aches and pain in the body, or stomach issues and difficulty with sleep, etc. And sometimes that people do not even realize that they're actually more from more psychological issues such as signs of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. The help-seeking pattern also play a role, similar to many immigrant groups, given, as I mentioned, the statistics that majority of the AAPI population in the US are foreign-born, so that with immigrants, people tend to seek help oftentimes within their circle of family and friends. But limited English proficiency play a role as well, as there are some structural factors such as the lack of access to mental health providers that are fluent in their language and culture. Now, what's encouraging is that the subsequent research have shown that when there is a match between the client practitioner's ethnicity and language, as well as the ethnic specific services that are programs that are tailored or specialized in serving a particular, the ethnic population or cultural population, they're associated with lower dropout rates, greater service utilization, and better treatment outcome. And over the years, there are a good number of these ethnic specific service programs in both the directly operated programming DMH as well as our contract providers. And I believe some of you are here in this meeting as well. And I'm just listing some of it. Long Beach API is the program that I manage. Coastal API in Gardena, these two are the DMH directly operated mental health clinic. And then APSC, part of Pacific Clinics in Rosemead, PACS, both officing sites in Long Beach and Culver City, LA. SSG with multiple locations, as well as APCTC in a number of locations. And SANS is one in Artesia that serve the South Asian community. So I try to list their phone numbers and the languages that they have capability of. Some of these may change as their staffing changes, but these are the general languages that these programs currently, or at least about within 6 months ago, that has. So some of the common issues for API youth and families, there is, even across the different API groups, are quite common for a lot of family conflict due to the acculturation differences across generations. And not uncommon to also have communication language barrier even within the same family, where parents and children have difficulty communicating because of language barrier. And sometimes, quite often, there's a role reversal because the children tend to be more familiar with a language and know how the system here and have almost helped the parent to navigate through a lot of things. So there's that factor as well. But there's also the cultural differences in expression of affection and parenting practices. So, for example, if my mom may not tell me that she loves me, but she may cook me a really, delicious soup for me, and I can understand that that's her sign of showing her love for me. But many of the children grew up here may not necessarily interpret that, be able to understand that. And many of because of these cultural differences, the children may not feel understood, may not feel accepted, may not feel emotionally supported. And there's also a tendency for a lot of high expectations around child academic achievements and the shame and disappointment around these failed expectations, both for the child and for the family. Now, I know I touched on earlier about the historical trauma about the offsprings of these individuals affected by these horrible trauma, even though they haven't experienced themselves, tend to have higher rates of illness. And with essentially almost all the AAPI groups have these tremendous historical trauma. And yet, I think what's important to recognize too, as you can see around you, that there are also so many examples of the hard work and success of many AAPI individuals. And again, it's just a testimony to the resilience of the AAPI population and the culture. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And just a quick point about some possible future directions. I think most Asian Americans generally will not go to a mental health clinic for services, but they will generally go see a family doctor. So one promising direction is to increase the capacity to recognize and treat common mental health conditions in the primary care setting. And also AAPI value education, so they're often receptive and quite eager to listen to educational presentations, seminars about mental health issues. So I think there's great potential to provide training, education to not only the FACE-centered volunteers in schools and community-based organizations, but also just to ordinary citizens, and to increase their ability to enhance their own well-being and to support the well-being of those around them. And lastly, the holistic approaches such as mindfulness-based treatment approaches and yoga, etc., are they were initially originated from Asian culture and even some of the spiritual traditions in Asia, but have been shown to be highly effective and important in the treatment of trauma, as well as just to improve the health and well-being of people in general. So I think the remaining here, just a couple slides of some of the resources that Robin talked about, right? And then also some of the mental health resources. Most of these that people are familiar with, I'm just listing them. And then I think there's also some popular phone apps that can be helpful in promoting mental health, and so that is my portion. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave some time for Pam.